When we were planning the session for the tag, of course, we were discussing Libra. So we need to have Libra as a topic at tag. And actually, I've been in touch with Nina Siedler, seeing how we can get this involved. And when thinking it through, we thought, okay, one of the major question marks on Libra is actually governance and decentralization. So how can we and how do we want to define governance structures? And Nina now will introduce an initiative by the Wharton School on finding a structured way to define decentralization and certain governance structures. Nina is attorney at law and partner at DWF, a very active member in several German working groups and international working groups and think tanks, and is working on legal and regulatory questions in the blockchain ecosystem. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Yes, the starting point was indeed Libra, but I'm happy that I'm not talking again about Libra, but can take a little bit more holistic view to crypto governance and share with you what a group organized by the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania is currently working on, and we're hoping to publish that maybe in 2 or 3 weeks' time. But as a starting point, you all know this chart, right? Distinguishing the different types of blockchains depending upon the validation being permissionless or permissioned, and whether they provide for a public or private access. I added some bullets there from the holistic governance point of view. So I'm not talking about consensus mechanisms or on-chain governance, but I'm talking about the whole governance of networks, right? The off-chain part is not really structured in the permissionless public systems. Most of this is done by, social media coordination, some core developer groups, some thought leaders, but the off-chain governance part is typically just historically grown, but not further structured. To the opposite, on the lower right-hand side, the permission and private systems, the typical, single entity DLT solutions or consortia. There you see typically a very well-structured governance, but which is built upon corporate governance structures. And I personally believe corporate governance is too little for networks like this. I personally see blockchain networks more in a comparison to states which have no geographic boundaries, but are rather centered around certain topics. So the pure, simple corporate governance structures need to be enhanced in order to create a fair and transparent system overall. And in that area, I really like to see to the upper right-hand side box develop further, because those permissioned public systems that we are seeing growing over time, they actually provide for an opportunity to explore a proper governance of the off-chain part, together with various different on-chain governance mechanisms. So, for example, the IPDB, the Interplanetary Database Foundation, we organize it in a way that only the members can run nodes, and we're working on a set of policies for those to make that more clear, and then everybody can basically do with the network whatever they want, but we create with a main chain like a trust anchor for various side chains that might build surrounding that. There are many more examples on that end. Decentralization has an issue, we heard it before. You need to fund it. people working on those things need to earn something to make a living. And that resulted, historically seen, during the past years in structures which typically base upon a public infrastructure, decentralized, and then alongside of that, people, founders especially, build their centralized ventures to make their own living. That's a great thing to do, right? Combining a non-profit infrastructure with for-profit companies, privately held companies, but and it kicked off basically with Ethereum and building the Ethereum Foundation. The problem with that is that there is always a conflict of interest involved in that, and plus, I personally don't believe that non-profit infrastructure, decentralized, should be governed or majorly influenced by a vehicle like a foundation. Why not? Because a foundation is the most autocratic governance model that you can think of, right? You separate funds into a vehicle, then you choose initial directors, and those will sit there for the rest of their lives, or as long as they like. And they can basically do whatever they like within the purpose, the given purpose of that foundation. In some jurisdictions, they can even amend the purpose, right? So that's not inclusive. It's not democratic at all. And from my perspective, doesn't make any sense. So we need to rethink that model. I personally like very much the association approach, which is membership-based. And then we need to think about how to organize that membership and to get it as broad as possible. And typically, founders would like to keep control for at least a certain period. I can understand that. It's their baby, right? They are kicking it off. They are organizing the funding initially. So how can they do that in an association-based model? Well, they can start off as directors, and they can choose typically in the beginning the term. Right? They can say, well, I will need 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and thereafter there will be a re-election of the directors, and then it really moves into the hands of the members and the network. Back again, problem financing. How to finance an open source, public, permissionless infrastructure. And I like to compare it to the streets outside, right? This is just the digital version of the streets outside, and we want to have them permissionless, we want to have them public, and ideally we want them not to be rent-seeking. So historically, this has been the task of governments and finance via tax. Nowadays, our governments, they lost track about the digital infrastructure and left it completely to the private company sector to build that. And that resulted by now in a large internet monopolies ruling this whole area. And I always understood, and that's why I got interested in the whole blockchain movement, that this is a counter movement against this development. But we started off, and then we came into the ICO hype. And again, we are seeing that we are just replicating old structures, right? Everybody is concentrating on its own profit making. We just heard it before, how do you fund these things? Everybody needs to make a living. I understand that, right? But the problem is that this ICO hype really splintered the whole movement into thousands of different projects, all of them building against silos, and all of them trying to compete and to fight for their own token, because the idea is first mover advantage, and my token will rise in value if I only get a sufficient number of users to join it. But that doesn't really work if there are too many projects trying to do the same thing. So I really believe we need to go back to our initial values, start working together again, not fighting against each other, and start to build a joint infrastructure and to move the for-profit ventures rather on the application layer but work together again on the base, on the protocol layer, to create something meaningful and something that really serves society. All right, how to overcome this this mechanism that we, again, in the blockchain space, see monopolies growing, see a concentration of wealth. So thank you very much. I don't see her, my prior speaker. That was a great contribution to this discussion. And I believe the starting point is transparency. We need to talk frankly about how the governance structures are built. And I'm very happy to be part of this group which met like 6 weeks ago in San Francisco, invited by the Wharton School. They got together a great crowd of, starting with people from the core blockchain Ethereum side to representatives of Facebook and R3 Quarter, a couple of professors from economics, social studies, and law, and that great group really started discussing what are the important questions to ask. And after that 2 days, we agreed that we would write these down, and we're still working on it. There is a group call every Monday, and we're hoping to get this questionnaire done by maybe in 2 or 3 weeks' time. And the holistic governance questions, including on and off-chain parts, they really require interdisciplinary input. There is no single science that can answer all important questions surrounding that. And I'm very happy that Jamin showed earlier this slide with the breakup of various groups in the economics field. And now add that with social studies, with computer studies, with legal studies, and then you really get a full picture. And we are really lacking proper research, and I'm happy that Jamin is picking a part of this up, even though concentrated on the economic side, which I personally believe is not sufficient to really cover the whole spectrum. And the question is, and I talked to a lot of professors about this, why is this the case? Why don't we have already proper research in that area? And the problem is, again, silos. Also in science, we have silos. The institutes need to publish in certain magazines in order to get funding. The magazines are concentrating on certain topics. So the research institutes are struggling with finding magazines publishing interdisciplinary studies, and hence they don't get funding for it. And I really can invite everybody to support thinking about how we resolve that problem, because I really believe we need to overcome this in order to build something meaningful. So, Wharton Disclosure Questionnaire. Let me give you a little bit of insight how this is structured. We have currently 5 sections. The first one is just a background section asking for the general purpose of the given network, success and metrics for success, the question if there is any coordinating entity or organization of any sort involved, and if participants in the network are identified in any manner. Then the most important thing, I believe, is to think about the stakeholder groups. We had long discussions about how to define stakeholder group. What does that term actually mean? And who does this include? So we tried to left it as open and as much to the viewpoint of the project, hopefully answering that question at some point, to define it itself, but we wanted to give a little bit of guidance, what you could think about. So we were coming up with this term of intrinsic groups. These are those groups which are recognized by dry or wet code, and which are built in the social or legal structure of the project. But we would also like to invite people to think about extrinsic groups. So those groups which are only more or less directly or even indirectly effective and not yet considered within the given governance of the system. So think maybe about competitors, right? And alike. And then there are questions surrounding how to actually access an intrinsic group, the ability and limitation to interact within that group. Is that group enabled to organize itself, to form opinions? And then also the question of costs of exiting the network or any of the groups built within the network. And then we come to the incentive schemes. That's basically surrounding the token economics topic. So what behaviors did the project decide that it wants to incentivize, and how does it do it? And for those projects already running for a while, it would be really nice to get some feedback on the experience with the chosen incentive mechanism and if it actually worked out as it was intended to. Then we turn in section 4 to the governance powers, sources and roots of the network's governance, and the policy setting. And you can compare like policy setting with the legislative in, democracies like in the Western world versus implementation power, which is the executive, and versus the interpretive power, which are basically the courts in our real world. And then we would like to add the fourth power, which is basically media, right? So who is creating transparency, and is transparency actually facilitated in your given network? And how do you build that in? And then after like structuring or thinking through what kind of powers did you build into your network, we turn to the procedures. So how are conflicts resolved in your network? What system of checks and balances do you provide for? How is the accountability organized amongst the governance powers of the groups? Voting, is there any formal voting? Is there any informal voting, like signaling, and how, and what part of that is actually coded? And then, system for protocol updates, development work, how is that all funded? Does the system provide for such a funding? So that's basically what we currently built. It got more than we wanted. Initially we said, let's try to just come up with 5 core questions, but it turned out it's not possible. So once you start talking about that, it's not possible to really limit it to a very small set of questions. I believe we are now, I don't know, at about 30. We arrived at about 30 in total to cover all these topics. Maybe just a few words coming back to my legal background, because there's so much discussion about DAOs. DAOs are a great idea, but I just would like you to consider what this means from a legal perspective. And I know, I'm aware it's very hard for like a global DAO to figure out whose jurisdiction is actually applicable, but I'm sure in the end, rather more than less jurisdictions will believe that they are applicable. So it's rather a bigger problem than a smaller one. If people gather to pursue a mutual goal, then they are forming an entity, if they want it or not. This is simply due to the fact that any group of people working together needs to choose between a specific set of entities. If you don't do that, you end up creating what I call the default entity, which is in Germany die GBR, die Gesellschaft bürgerlichen Rechts. Any kind of jurisdiction knows such default entity, and it typically comes along in any jurisdiction with unlimited liability of everyone involved. So that's rather something to avoid, right? And I know it's unfortunate, and you would love to do it differently, and do it without any legal framework, but law really applies universally. You cannot exclude it. This is simply what automatically happens if you don't make a distinct choice what else you want. So we started discussing if we could maybe see it rather as star contracts compared to franchise system. In the end, it doesn't really work. If you do a joint voting on stuff, if you organize like a partnership or like a company, you will find yourself in such a setting. So that's the reason why also we need to think about how to organize this better. And Malta is making some steps. We'll see when this comes up. Yeah. So in the end, I would like to invite you to rethink about governance structures, because I personally believe that the history through which we went during the past years did not lead to a healthy development of the whole ecosystem. I think we need to focus a little bit more on the social impact of the networks we are building, and not only to see them as economic mechanisms and as private wealth growing tools, but get back to the idea that we are building digital streets, that we want them to be open and permissionless, and that at least the basic infrastructure shouldn't be profit driven, but should be there for everyone to access it, and to move the for-profit things rather on the application layer, which would enhance collaboration again, and which would certainly, lead to systems that I guess we all can quickly agree on will deliver a better world to the next generations, our kids in advance, in opposite to building something that creates roadblocks at any intersection where you want to make a turn, as it is right now, because every system is expecting its own toll in its own currency, and that's not really helpful and sustainable. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nina. Thanks for being here. And I think this Wharton School initiative and this project is open to everybody to join in and contribute.
Well, it started with a group of 30 people really sitting for 2 days around a table. And it will be, the Cryptogovernance Disclosure Questionnaire will be published, and whoever wants to use it can use it. There will be certain groups trying to motivate their projects to actually participate and answer all of those questions, which might not even be that convenient to do if you're forced to think about things that you maybe rather avoid talking about. And then we will see how we can gather that, and if we actually find a research institute picking up on the data that we're producing by collecting those answers to the questionnaires. Yeah, but everything will be public except for projects choosing not to have their answers published, right?
All right, thanks a lot. We will definitely share once this paper is published, and so stay tuned and get in touch with Nina. You'll find her Twitter contact on the speakers page, tech.io/speakers. Thank you.